You're nothing but a street animal in a tailored suit.
In the fall of 1963, a decorated New York police officer humiliated Bumpy Johnson in front of an entire Harlem block. He didn't do it in some dark alley. He didn't do it in a closed room. He did it under church lights, in front of mothers dressed in black, reporters clutching notepads, and children standing on tiptoe trying to understand why all the grown-ups had gone suddenly silent. The officer knocked Bumpy's hat into the street. Then he called him a street animal in a tailored suit. People expected gunfire before midnight. They expected sirens, broken windows, bodies, revenge. Instead, Bumpy Johnson bent down, picked up his hat, brushed the dirt from the brim, looked the officer in the eye, and smiled. That smile frightened the wrong people. Because less than 24 hours later, the same officer who had laughed in Bumpy's face was stripped of his badge, marched out of his precinct, abandoned by the newspapers that once loved him, and left staring at the ruins of a career he thought was untouchable. And the most terrifying part? Bumpy never touched him. He made one phone call. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the beginning. New York in 1963 was a city dressed in wealth and powered by fear. Downtown, men in wool overcoats shook hands over martinis and talked about progress, investment, and law and order. Uptown, in Harlem, mothers double-locked their doors at night and prayed their sons made it home before the police decided to make an example out of somebody. The newspapers called it tension. The people living in it called it survival. Harlem had its own rules, its own music, its own pain, and its own kings. And whether people loved him, feared him, or pretended not to know his name, everybody knew Bumpy Johnson. He was a contradiction in a dark suit, part philosopher, part outlaw. A man who could quote poetry one moment and make hard men fall silent the next. Children nodded at him on corners. Shopkeepers watched him pass with guarded respect. Ministers condemned him from pulpits and quietly accepted his donations for broken church boilers and funeral costs. He was not a saint, but he understood power. And he understood something even more important than power: timing. The man who insulted him that night was Lieutenant Raymond Keegan, a broad-shouldered police officer with a war hero's posture and a politician's smile. Keegan had become a rising star in the department because he knew exactly how to perform for white cameras. He gave reporters clean quotes, gave politicians clean headlines, and gave Harlem dirty hands. The papers called him fearless. Harlem called him something else. He was the kind of cop who kicked in doors first and asked questions later. The kind who smiled while humiliating a man in front of his wife. The kind who could turn a nightstick into a sermon and call the bruises justice. And lately, Keegan had become obsessed with one name: Bumpy Johnson. Not because Bumpy had threatened him, not because Bumpy had attacked him, but because Keegan understood that as long as Harlem still bowed its head to a man like Bumpy before it bowed to a badge, his own authority would always be incomplete. He didn't just want to arrest Bumpy. He wanted to reduce him. He wanted the neighborhood to see its king made small. He got his chance on a cold Thursday evening outside Mount Calvary Baptist Church. The church had opened its basement for a community fundraiser. A 19-year-old boy named Daniel Price had been beaten so badly during a police sweep 2 weeks earlier that he died in the hospital without ever fully waking up. Officially, the department called it resistance during arrest. Harlem called it murder. The fundraiser was supposed to help Daniel's mother keep her apartment and bury her son without debt. Bumpy had sent money quietly the day before. Then, Against the advice of almost everyone around him, he decided to attend in person. He arrived just after 7. No entourage, no parade. Just a black Cadillac at the curb, a long charcoal coat, polished shoes, gloves in one hand, and that calm expression that made nervous men feel as if he could already hear the lie forming in their mouths. With him were 3 men who had worked at his side for years. Isaiah Boone, heavy-shouldered and silent, an ex-boxer with hands like stone. Leon "Silk" Mercer, narrow-faced and watchful, a man who could learn your secrets by standing in the same room as you for 5 minutes. And Tommy Reed, younger than the others, all heat and impatience, the kind of loyal man who mistook anger for strength. The sidewalk outside the church was packed. Women in hats, men in overcoats, boys smoking and pretending not to stare. A pair of local reporters, 2 squad cars idling at the corner. And standing on the church steps, as if the entire night had been arranged for his benefit, was Lieutenant Raymond Keegan. He was bareheaded despite the cold, his blonde hair slicked back, gloves tucked beneath one arm, jaw clean and sharp beneath the street lamp. At his side were 4 officers and a sergeant holding a notebook, as if this were official business instead of theater. Keegan saw Bumpy the moment the Cadillac door opened. A smile spread across his face. Not the smile of a man pleased to see somebody, the smile of a man who had just found the audience for the performance he'd been rehearsing in his head. "Well," Keegan said loudly, turning so the crowd and the reporters could hear every word. "Look what the night dragged in." Conversations stopped. Bumpy climbed from the car, buttoned his coat, and looked up the church steps. He didn't answer. Keegan descended slowly, boots hard against stone. "This is a memorial," he said. "A church gathering, not a convention for parasites." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Tommy Reed took 1 step forward, but Isaiah Boone put a hand across his chest and held him there. Bumpy remained still. "I came to pay my respects," Bumpy said. His voice was soft. That made people lean in. Keegan laughed. "With whose money? Yours? Or money taken off desperate people too poor to know better?" Daniel Price's mother was standing just inside the church doors. She heard it. Everybody heard it. That was what made the insult unforgivable. Not that Keegan targeted Bumpy, but that he turned a grieving mother's night into a stage. Bumpy looked past Keegan and nodded once toward Mrs. Price. "My respects are for her," he said. "Not for you." That should have been the end of it. A decent man would have stepped aside. Raymond Keegan was not a decent man. He moved closer until he stood 1 arm's length away. "You don't give respect," he said. "You buy silence and call it charity." One of the reporters began scribbling furiously. Keegan saw the pen moving and got bolder. "Maybe we ought to search him," he said. "Wouldn't want our community benefactor bringing trouble into God's house." The officers beside him chuckled. Bumpy's face didn't change. Isaiah Boone's jaw flexed once. Tommy Reed whispered, "Say the word." Bumpy ignored him. Keegan reached out, not to search, but to provoke. He flicked 2 fingers against the brim of Bumpy's dark fedora. The hat tipped, spun, and landed in the gutter beside the curb. There was a sound from the crowd then, not loud, not dramatic, but worse. A collective intake of breath.
because now everyone understood this had crossed into something deeper than insult. Keegan looked around, enjoying himself. "See?" he said. "Silk suit, polished shoes, fancy car. Still just gutter-born." Then he leaned in and delivered the line he would spend the rest of his life regretting. "No matter how expensive the costume," he said, "a street animal is still an animal." Silence. The kind of silence that makes people hear their own heartbeat. Tommy Reed's hand dropped toward his coat. Isaiah Boone shifted his weight. Leon Mercer watched Keegan with the cold expression of a man measuring curtains for a funeral.
But Bumpy did something none of them expected. He bent down. He picked up the hat. He brushed the gutter water from the brim with slow, careful fingers. Then he set it back on his head. No rush, no shaking, no anger. He looked Raymond Keegan directly in the eyes and said, "Lieutenant, there are two kinds of men who need an audience: actors and cowards." Keegan's smile tightened. Bumpy stepped closer, close enough that only the front row of onlookers could hear his next words. "You should pray," Bumpy said, "that your badge protects you from the truth." Then he turned, walked past the stunned crowd, and went into the church basement. No explosion, no punches, no gunfire, which somehow felt far more dangerous. Inside, the room smelled of coffee, candle wax, damp wool, and grief. Mrs. Price stood near a folding table covered with envelopes. When Bumpy approached, she looked exhausted beyond tears. He took her hand in both of his. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. She studied his face for a moment. "I heard what he said." Bumpy nodded once. "He wanted you to answer him," she said. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" Bumpy glanced toward the church windows, where blue police lights pulsed faintly across the glass. "Because some men build their whole lives waiting for the wrong blow," he said. Mrs. Price looked at him for another long second, then squeezed his hand. "My boy is dead because too many men wanted to prove something," she whispered. "Don't become one more." Bumpy lowered his head. "I won't." He left an envelope on the table and walked away. No one saw how much money was inside until later. By then, the amount had already become rumor. Outside, Keegan was still smiling for reporters. He gave a statement before climbing into his squad car. He spoke of criminal influence, civic rot, and the bravery of law enforcement. He made himself sound righteous. He made Bumpy sound like a contamination in a good city. By 10 o'clock, the story had started moving through bars, pool halls, card rooms, and apartment kitchens all over Harlem. The lieutenant had publicly humiliated Bumpy Johnson. The lieutenant had knocked his hat into the gutter. The lieutenant had called him an animal in front of women and children. By midnight, people were placing bets on how Keegan would disappear. Tommy Reed wanted to drive downtown that very hour. Isaiah Boone suggested patience, though the look in his eyes promised violence later. Leon Mercer said nothing at all, which was never a good sign. But inside Bumpy's apartment on 7th Avenue, the man at the center of the storm sat in a leather chair beside the lamp, pouring himself a measured finger of cognac, as if the city weren't bracing for blood. He listened while the others talked over one another. "He disgraced you in public," Tommy said. "If you let that stand, everybody watches." Isaiah's voice came low and rough. "Men like him don't stop at one insult. They keep going until somebody stops them." Leon stood by the window, looking down at the avenue. He wanted a reaction. That doesn't mean he won't get one. Bumpy swirled the cognac once, watching the light move through amber. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Why tonight? Tommy blinked. Because he hates you. No, Bumpy said. Plenty of men hate me. Hate is cheap. Why tonight? The room fell quiet. Bumpy set the glass down and stood. He picked a church, a funeral fundraiser, reporters, witnesses. He didn't insult me because he lost his temper. Bumpy adjusted one cuff. He insulted me because he needed something. Leon turned from the window. You think he's desperate? I know desperate, Bumpy said. It leaves fingerprints. He walked to the bookshelf near the fireplace and crouched beside a locked cabinet built into the wall. From his pocket, he took a brass key. He opened the cabinet and removed a slim navy file tied with black string. Tommy frowned. What is that? Bumpy looked at the file for a moment before answering. That, he said, is Lieutenant Raymond Keegan's obituary. And before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. And don't forget to subscribe. For 6 months, Bumpy had been hearing the same name from too many frightened mouths. Raymond Keegan, a butcher on 132nd Street who had to pay weekly cash just to keep inspectors from harassing him. A numbers runner whose money disappeared during an arrest and never reached evidence. A widow whose nephew got 3 years in prison after a pistol was miraculously found under his car seat during a stop Keegan personally supervised. A jazz club owner forced to hand over envelopes every Friday to avoid being raided on Saturday. 1 complaint could be ignored. 2 could be dismissed. But 6 months of identical patterns? That was business. And Bumpy understood business better than most men understood prayer. He had not moved against Keegan earlier for a simple reason. A crooked cop with ambition was dangerous, but a crooked cop who believed himself safe was useful. Safe men made mistakes. Safe men got comfortable. Safe men wrote things down. That Navy file contained copies of ledger pages, payment schedules, photographs, license plate numbers, even a recorded statement from one of Keegan's own patrol partners, a tired Irish cop named Patrick Dolan, who had started drinking too much after watching good men become tools for bad ones. Dolan had never testified publicly. He hadn't needed to. Bumpy believed in insurance. He didn't keep the file in his apartment because he trusted locks. He kept a copy because he trusted preparation. The original was somewhere else, somewhere much more dangerous. Leon Mercer stepped closer. You've had this all along? Yes. And you waited? Yes. Tommy stared at him in disbelief. He knocks your hat in the gutter, calls you an animal, and now you're talking about paperwork? Bumpy turned slowly toward him. Do you know why men like Keegan wear rage so comfortably? He asked. Tommy didn't answer. Because rage is where they are strongest. It's their language, their excuse, their shelter. Bumpy's eyes hardened. If I answer him with bullets, he becomes a martyr. If I answer him with fists, he becomes a victim. But if I answer him with truth, he becomes what he really is. Isaiah folded his arms. And what is that? Bumpy untied the black string and opened the file. A thief, he said. He laid out the evidence piece by piece on the dining table. Deposit slips to a savings account in a fake name. A photograph of Keegan leaving the back entrance of a Bronx bookmaker's office with an envelope tucked inside his coat. Carbon copies from an auto garage that serviced a police-issued car caught making late-night visits to clubs that were paying for protection. A handwritten page listing businesses and weekly amounts. 25 from the butcher, 40 from the club, 15 from the grocer, 10 from a woman who ran a beauty shop and had 2 daughters in Catholic school. Tommy's anger changed shape then. It became focus. Isaiah let out a slow breath through his nose. Leon picked up the statement from Patrolman Dolan and read in silence. When he finished, he placed it back on the table carefully. "This is enough to hang him," Leon said. "It's enough to bury him," Bumpy replied. "If it reaches the right hands." Tommy leaned in. "Then we take it to the papers." Bumpy shook his head. "The papers made him. They'll protect him if they can." "Internal affairs?" "Too many friends." "The commissioner?" "Too political." Leon's eyes narrowed. "Then who?" For the first time that night, Bumpy smiled. Not warmly, not pleasantly. The kind of smile a chess player gives when the board has already tilted. "My lawyer," he said. Her name was Evelyn Shaw. She was one of the few people in New York City who could walk into a room full of wealthy white men, let them underestimate her for 30 seconds, and leave with their signatures, their fear, and their respect. She was in her early 40s, precise in speech, impossible to rattle, and she had represented Bumpy often enough to understand the difference between his impulses and his intentions. Years earlier, when Bumpy first brought her evidence against a judge who had been fixing sentencing recommendations for money, she told him something he never forgot. "Violence ends the conversation," she had said. "Documents begin one." Since then, whenever Bumpy uncovered something truly lethal, not to the body, but to reputation, office, or influence, he made a copy for Evelyn. She kept those copies in a bank vault under attorney-client privilege, sealed and dated. Insurance. Leon looked at the file again. "You're saying one woman can bring down a lieutenant?" Bumpy corrected him. "No, I'm saying one phone call can." At 11:43 that night, Bumpy put on his coat and left the apartment alone. He did not take the Cadillac. He did not take Isaiah or Leon or Tommy. He walked 6 blocks through the cold Harlem air with his collar up and his hat low, past laundromats going dark, past men smoking under neon signs, past a boy singing to himself on a stoop because children can continue being children even while history rearranges itself around them. At the corner of 125th and St. Nicholas, he stepped into a pharmacy that was still open and nodded to the old man behind the register. In the back, beside a rack of comic books and a humming cooler full of soda bottles, stood a payphone. Bumpy took a nickel from his pocket. He dialed a number from memory. The line rang once, twice. Then Evelyn Shaw answered with a voice as steady as winter. "Yes?" "It's me," Bumpy said. A pause. She recognized his tone before his name. "Is somebody dead?" she asked. "Not yet." Another short silence. Then, very calmly, "Do you want the blue envelope?" "I do." "Are you certain?" Bumpy glanced through the pharmacy window at the street outside, at the city still pretending that all its power belonged to men with badges and columns in the newspaper. "He made it public," Bumpy said. "So now, we make it permanent." Evelyn did not ask what happened. She didn't need details. "When?" she asked. "Now." "All copies?" "Yes." "The district attorney's office?" "Yes." Internal Affairs? Yes. The Commissioner? Yes. The press? Bumpy considered for half a second. The right reporter, he said. Not the loudest one. The one who still hates crooked men more than he loves headlines. I know which one. I'm sure you do. And your name? Bumpy looked at the receiver in his hand. Nowhere, he said. Evelyn's answer came like a stamped seal. By sunrise. The line clicked dead. That was it. No shouting, no threat, no speech. One call. Bumpy placed the receiver back in its cradle, adjusted his gloves, and walked out into the night. The city did not tremble. No thunder split the sky. No police sirens suddenly wailed in warning. History almost never sounds dramatic while it's happening. Most of the time, it sounds like a nickel dropping into a payphone. The first crack appeared at 6:20 the next morning, while Raymond Keegan was shaving. He lived on the Upper West Side in a rent-controlled apartment too elegant for a lieutenant's salary and too expensive to explain honestly. His wife, Margaret, sat at the kitchen table in a silk robe, reading the paper and drinking coffee that had gone cold. Keegan was humming when the phone rang. Margaret answered first. She listened for 5 seconds, then turned toward the bathroom with a look on her face he had never seen before. "Ray," she said slowly, "it's the precinct." He wiped shaving cream from his jaw and took the call. His desk sergeant sounded strange, too formal. "Lieutenant, the captain wants you in immediately." Keegan frowned. "Why?" A beat. "Sir, Internal Affairs is here." The razor slipped in Keegan's hand and nicked his cheek. He stared at the blood in the sink. "What are you talking about?" "I think you should come in, sir." The line went dead. Behind him, in the mirror, Margaret had risen from the table. "What happened?" she asked. Keegan forced a laugh. "Nothing. Somebody's overeager." But his voice didn't land right. Because deep down, before the evidence, before the questions, before the humiliation to come, crooked men always recognize the sound of the floor shifting beneath them. He dressed too fast, tied his tie wrong once, redid it, grabbed his coat, and left without finishing breakfast. On the drive downtown, he told himself it was routine. A complaint, a misunderstanding. Somebody he arrested trying to save himself. By the time he reached the precinct house, there were already 2 unmarked sedans parked outside. Not a good sign. Inside, the air had changed. Men who usually greeted him avoided his eyes. A rookie at the front desk pretended to be busy with paperwork. The desk sergeant, who laughed at all his jokes, stood stiff and pale. And outside the captain's office were 2 men Keegan did not know. One from Internal Affairs, one from the district attorney's office. That was the moment he understood this wasn't a complaint. Complaints arrived with noise. This had arrived with paperwork. If you like this story, subscribe to my channel for more beautiful stories. Captain Howard Brenner did not invite Keegan to sit. That alone told a story. Brenner was red around the ears, one hand flat on the desk, the other holding a folder so tightly the cardboard had started to bend. He was a political creature, not a brave one. And at that moment, he looked like a man wondering whether self-preservation required moral outrage. "Do you know why you're here?" Brenner asked. Keegan put on his best expression of controlled offense. "No, sir." The Internal Affairs investigator, a narrow man with silver hair and a voice like sandpaper, opened a second folder. "Let me help you," he said. He slid the first document across the desk. A ledger page. Weekly cash collections. Street names. Businesses. Amounts. Keegan looked at it and gave the reaction of a practiced liar. Not too strong, not too weak. Just enough disbelief to seem plausible. "This is garbage." The investigator laid down a photograph beside it. Keegan exiting the service door of the Linux Imperial Club at 2:13 a.m., envelope in hand, date stamped. Then a deposit slip. Then a typed statement from Patrolman Patrick Dolan. Then a list of false arrest numbers linked to dismissed cases and missing evidence cache. Each page landed softly. But to Keegan, each one sounded like dirt on a coffin. He felt the back of his neck turn cold. "This is fabricated," he said. "Every bit of it." Brenner slammed a hand on the desk. "Fabricated? There are account numbers, Raymond. Your wife's sister's address tied to a secondary account in Yonkers. Deposits matching the collection schedule down to the dollar." Keegan's mouth went dry. He hadn't known anyone found the Yonkers account. That was the first real panic. He tried indignation next. "You think I'm on the take? After my record? After Brooklyn? After the medals?" The district attorney's representative finally spoke. A woman in a dark wool coat, severe and composed. "We think," she said, "that your record may be what allowed this to continue." That hit him harder than shouting would have. He looked at Brenner. "Who brought this in?" Nobody answered, which told him enough. This evidence hadn't dribbled out of one frightened witness. It had been assembled, prepared, timed. Then the investigator reached into his folder one final time and pulled out the page that finished the job. A sealed affidavit from Evelyn Shaw, attorney at law, certifying chain of custody for a packet of documents stored in bank deposit box 447B, received in confidence months earlier and released that morning to appropriate authorities due to imminent public harm and credible risk of evidence destruction. Keegan's eyes stopped on the date. Months earlier. Months. That meant he hadn't been hunted overnight. He had been watched, studied, held. And only now, after the scene at the church, had the trap been sprung. In his head, like a match being struck in a dark room, he suddenly saw Bumpy Johnson picking up that hat, brushing it clean, smiling. You should pray that your badge protects you from the truth. Keegan sat down without being asked. For the first time in years, he looked smaller than his uniform. At 9:15 a.m., they took his badge. At 9:17, they took his revolver. At 9:22, they suspended him pending criminal investigation. At 9:40, a reporter from the Daily Mirror called the precinct asking for comment on corruption allegations involving Lieutenant Raymond Keegan. At 10:05, a second reporter called, this one asking whether Keegan had extorted Harlem businesses and planted evidence in exchange for cash. By 10:30, the commissioner's office issued a statement promising full cooperation. By 11 o'clock, Raymond Keegan had become radioactive. The same men who once bragged about serving under him now remembered they had doubts. The same reporters who loved photographing his medal ceremonies now wrote phrases like serious misconduct and deeply troubling allegations. The same politicians who had smiled beside him at charity luncheons suddenly had no comment. A man can spend 10 years building an image and lose it before lunch. That afternoon, the second part of his life collapsed. When Keegan got home, Margaret was waiting. No robe this time, no coffee. She stood beside the dining room table with a newspaper, a bank statement, and a look of calm fury more frightening than tears. "Who is Ellen Ford?" she asked. Keegan stared blankly. She lifted the Yonkers account paperwork. "The name on the account, the one linked to my sister's address." He said nothing. "And don't lie again," Margaret said. "I spent all morning learning what your silence costs." He reached for the paper. She pulled it away. "It isn't what it looks like." That sentence had saved weak men for generations. It failed here, too. "What it looks like," she said, "is that my husband took money from store owners and club owners and men too poor to fight back, and hid it under a woman's name while preaching integrity to this city." He moved toward her. "Margaret." She stepped back. "No, not another inch." There was no screaming then, just a total withdrawal of warmth. Sometimes that is worse. "I married an officer," she said. "I defended a public servant. If I'd wanted to sleep beside a thief, I could have chosen one without the uniform." Then she gave him the final cruelty a dishonest man never expects from his own home. She looked embarrassed for him. By evening, Margaret had gone to her sister's house. By nightfall, the superintendent downstairs had seen a television crew parked outside the building. At the church on Lenox Avenue, Daniel Price's mother heard the news from a neighbor before supper. She sat down in her small kitchen and cried for the first time in days. Not because justice had arrived in full, nothing could return her son, but because for once a powerful man had not walked away untouched. In a barber shop 2 blocks over, men stopped arguing long enough to let the radio finish the report. In a beauty shop, a woman whose husband had been shaken down by Keegan for months covered her mouth and whispered, "Lord, don't rush, but he don't sleep." At a grocery on 134th Street, an old man who had paid protection money from the cash register every Friday leaned against the counter and smiled into the middle distance like he was remembering what dignity felt like. And in Bumpy's apartment, the radio played low while Leon Mercer read the afternoon editions stacked on the table. "Decorated lieutenant faces corruption probe," Leon read. "Evidence suggests systemic extortion targeting Harlem merchants." Tommy Reed let out a low whistle. "That's it? Corruption probe? He called you an animal." Bumpy sat near the window, one ankle resting over the opposite knee, reading a hardback book he had barely turned a page in. "What would satisfy you?" he asked. Tommy frowned. "More." Isaiah Boone, seated across the room, spoke without looking up. "More is what weak men need after they've already won." Tommy looked from one to the other and finally fell silent. Leon set the paper down. "He knows it was you." Bumpy nodded. "You worried what he'll do?" Bumpy closed the book. "No." "Why not?" "Because men like Keegan know how to hit. They don't know how to fall." That evening, shortly after 7, the phone rang. Isaiah answered, listened, then handed the receiver to Bumpy. "It's Evelyn." Bumpy took the call. "Yes?" Her voice was as composed as ever. "The district attorney has opened a formal investigation. Internal Affairs is widening it. And your reporter did exactly what you hoped." "What did he print?" "He asked why a lieutenant's salary needed 3 undeclared accounts and weekly cash from Harlem businesses." Bumpy let out a quiet breath. "That will do." "There's one more thing," Evelyn said. "Yes?" "Patrolman Dolan came in voluntarily." That got Bumpy's full attention. "He signed?" "He signed and named 2 others." Bumpy looked out over the avenue where headlights slid through dusk like silver fish in black water. Then Keegan's finished. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He is." She paused. "I assume you feel satisfied." Bumpy did not answer immediately. Outside, the city kept moving. Horns, footsteps, distant music. Finally, he said, "Satisfied is for gamblers and children. I feel balanced." After he hung up, Tommy asked the question hanging over the whole room. "That's it?" Bumpy looked at him. "That's enough." Tommy shook his head. "He humiliated you in public." "No," Bumpy said calmly. "He humiliated himself in public. I simply made sure the rest of the city got introduced to the real man." The next morning, Raymond Keegan tried to walk into the precinct in civilian clothes. He thought perhaps distance from the uniform might help. It didn't. A uniformed officer met him at the front door and blocked his way. "I'm here to collect personal items," Keegan said. The young officer nodded, but there was no respect in it. Only procedure. "You'll be escorted." Escorted. The word cut deeper than accusation. Inside, desks went quiet as he passed. Nobody saluted. Nobody joked. Nobody said his name with familiarity. His office had already been emptied into 2 cardboard boxes. Framed commendations, a service plaque, spare cufflinks, a cigar cutter, family photographs, a gold fountain pen from some mayoral dinner. His life reduced to paper and metal. As he reached for the first box, he heard someone coming down the corridor behind him. It was Patrolman Patrick Dolan. Dolan stopped 3 paces away. The 2 men stared at each other. "You," Keegan said softly. Dolan's eyes were bloodshot, but steady. "Yeah, me." Keegan laughed once in disbelief. "After everything I did for you." Dolan's expression didn't move. "You mean after everything you made me help you do?" Keegan stepped closer. "You signed your own end too, you stupid drunk." "Maybe," Dolan said, "but I was already ending. Difference is, I got tired of rotting while you kept getting promoted." For a long moment, Keegan looked like he wanted to hit him. But what would that change? 2 detectives were standing 20 feet away, and besides, even Keegan finally understood that some damage can't be punched backward. He lifted the boxes and walked out. On the sidewalk, a photographer caught him carrying them to his car. That photograph ran the next day. Not in uniform, not heroic. Just another disgraced man in a wrinkled overcoat, carrying proof that the city had stopped believing him. If you like this story, subscribe to my channel for more beautiful stories. 3 days later, the formal charges came down. Extortion, falsifying reports, tampering with evidence, unlawful seizure of property. The district attorney hinted there might be more. The department suspended his pension review pending outcome. The commissioner publicly stated that no badge stands above the law. A sentence spoken every year in America and believed almost never. But this time, people wanted to believe it. In Harlem, the story moved like gospel. Not because people were naive enough to think one fallen lieutenant had fixed the city, but because humiliation had been answered without surrender and without chaos. That mattered. A week after the church incident, Daniel Price's mother received an anonymous payment that covered the rest of the funeral debt and 6 months of rent. No note, no signature, just relief. She knew where it came from anyway. At the corner of 138th and Lenox, Tommy Reed asked Bumpy a question he'd been carrying for days. They were standing beside the Cadillac while traffic crawled past and men argued over baseball on the sidewalk. "You knew all along, didn't you?" "Knew what?" "That he was dirty enough to destroy. That one day you might need it." Bumpy watched a bus wheeze to a stop across the avenue. "I knew he was building a house without foundation." "And you just waited?" Bumpy turned to him. "Tommy, when a man is digging his own grave, impatience is disrespectful." Tommy laughed despite himself. Then his expression changed. "Did it bother you, what he said?" Bumpy looked ahead for a moment before answering. "Yes." That surprised Tommy more than anger would have. Bumpy continued. "People think discipline means not feeling insult. That's childish. I felt every word." His voice remained even. "I just refused to let his words choose my method." Tommy nodded slowly. "I'm still learning that." "We all are," Bumpy said. Later that night, Leon Mercer brought one more piece of news. "Margaret Keegan filed for separation," he said. Bumpy, seated at the dining table with a plate of untouched food in front of him, simply nodded. Leon studied him. "No pleasure?" Bumpy shook his head. "A wife leaving a dishonest man isn't justice. It's cleanup." "What about Keegan?" "What about him?" Leon lit a cigarette. "He's finished. No precinct will touch him. No paper will defend him. Half the city thinks he's filth, and the other half thinks he's unlucky." Bumpy leaned back. "Then maybe," he said, "for the first time in his life, he understands Harlem a little better." Weeks passed. Autumn deepened. The city moved on, because cities always do. New scandals rose. New speeches were given. New lies were printed over old ones. But Raymond Keegan never returned to the version of himself he had once been. Some said he tried to get work as private security and was turned away quietly. Some said he spent afternoons drinking in a Queen's tavern where nobody cared about medals. Some said he was still insisting he'd been betrayed, as though betrayal were worse than the things he'd actually done. Maybe all of it was true. One rainy evening near the end of November, Bumpy sat alone at a restaurant table near the window while jazz drifted low from the back room. He was wearing a dark suit and reading from a book of essays, though his eyes were really on the rain sliding down the glass. Mrs. Price entered unexpectedly. She saw him, hesitated, then approached. "Mr. Johnson?" He rose slightly from his chair. "Mrs. Price?" "You helped me." He inclined his head. "I was able to do something." She looked down at her gloves. "My son still isn't here." "No," Bumpy said. "But that officer won't do to somebody else's son what he did to mine." Her voice trembled once, then steadied. "That matters." Bumpy motioned to the empty chair across from him. "Please." She sat. For a moment, they simply listened to the rain. Then she asked the question only a mother who had suffered enough could ask honestly. "Did you ever want to kill him?" Bumpy did not pretend to misunderstand. "Yes." She nodded. No judgment, just truth meeting truth. "Why didn't you?" He looked out at the wet street, the headlights smearing gold across the pavement. "Because dead men become stories," he said. "But exposed men become warnings." Mrs. Price absorbed that. Then, quietly, "My Daniel used to say the worst thing for a bully isn't getting hit. It's getting seen." A small smile touched Bumpy's face. Your boy was right. When she stood to leave, she touched his hand lightly. "Thank you for choosing the harder thing," she said. After she left, Bumpy remained at the table a long while. There are moments even powerful men don't speak about. Moments when victory tastes less like triumph and more like an accounting. Raymond Keegan had fallen, but Daniel Price was still dead. Harlem was still Harlem. The city's machinery would grind on, swallowing names and spitting out headlines until another mother stood in another church basement wondering how grief could possibly cost so much. Bumpy knew that. That was why he never mistook one win for peace. But he also knew this: fear had changed addresses. For years, men in uniform believed humiliation only traveled one direction, from authority to the powerless, from the state to the street, from the microphone to the man without one. Raymond Keegan learned otherwise. He learned that if you mock a man who has disciplined himself beyond your imagination, you may force him to answer in the one language you cannot survive. Not violence, not rage. Precision. A month later, at a small gathering in a back room above a Lenox Avenue club, Tommy retold the story for a fresh crowd with all the excitement of a man who had witnessed something legendary. He made the church bigger than it was. He made Keegan louder. He made Bumpy's silence almost supernatural. When he finished, the room buzzed with admiration. Isaiah Boone, seated near the wall with a drink in his hand, finally said, "You're telling it wrong." Tommy frowned. "How?" Isaiah looked toward Bumpy, who was standing by the window, hands folded behind his back. "It wasn't the phone call that destroyed Keegan," Isaiah said. "The phone call just opened the door." Tommy glanced between them. "Then what destroyed him?" Bumpy answered without turning around. "The belief," he said, "that he could do anything in public and nothing in private would ever catch up." Nobody spoke after that, because everybody in the room knew men like Keegan were not rare. They were simply usually luckier. The legend of that night traveled through Harlem the way true stories always do, through barbershops, kitchens, cab rides, poker tables, beauty parlors, and church steps. Some people said Bumpy had a judge in his pocket. Some said he had the commissioner blackmailed. Some swore he had federal men waiting before the church doors even closed. But the truth was simpler, and therefore more frightening. He had patience. He had evidence. And when the moment came, he had the discipline not to waste either. That was the part people remembered most. Not the insult, not the fallen hat, not even the disgrace of Lieutenant Raymond Keegan walking out of the precinct with his life in boxes. They remembered the smile. That calm, cold smile of a man who understood that real power doesn't scream when it has been challenged. Real power takes a breath, makes a call, and lets the truth do what bullets never could. So when older men in Harlem later told younger men about Bumpy Johnson, they didn't always begin with the shootings, the deals, the reputation, or the fear. Sometimes they began with a church fundraiser in 1963, a cruel officer, a hat in the gutter, and a king who refused to become an animal for the amusement of smaller men. Because in the end, Raymond Keegan lost his badge, his name, his standing, his marriage, and every false layer he had wrapped around himself. Bumpy lost nothing. Not his composure, not his dignity, not the room. And that is why the city remembered one man as a scandal and the other as a legend. If you like this story, subscribe to my channel for more beautiful stories.